Hi, this is Carter Hughley from the Center for Government Excellence. Purpose of this video is to provide you some quick tips on pivoting in Microsoft Excel, but I'm going to lead up to that by starting with filtering because I think understanding filtering is an important foundation to really understanding what pivoting is really all about. So I want to begin with just showing you this data set on backlogs and bottlenecks, which you may be familiar with. So you're just looking at a basic Excel spreadsheet with uh, rows here 1 through 10 shown on your screen and columns here A through J shown on your screen as well. I've zoomed in on the text to make it a little bit easier to see. So this is just your typical data set, and if you sort of scroll all the way down, you can see that this data set has lots of records in it. Not as many as some pieces of data, but we're talking about I believe 1,802, excuse me. So almost 2,000 records in this data set. One of the things that you notice right off the bat is that one of the first fields, which is closure date, doesn't seem to have values in all of it. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why that matters and how to be careful with that. But the first thing I want to talk about is filtering. So you're sitting here looking at a piece of or a set of information that seems to be about these cases that have referral dates, and there's something called a CAPSTAT date, and there's days open, days overview, backlog, abuse, and allegations. So I'm just sort of quickly summarizing that this data set seems to be about some bad things that have happened related to abuse and allegations of abuse. I can just sort of assume that based on these couple of fields. So what if I were to ask, like, how many records in this data set are related to the allegation of neglect? You can see neglect is sort of the first couple records listed here. Scrolling through, just like I'm doing now, is not obviously a good way to answer that question. So we're going to do something called filtering, which is a quick way to try to answer a simple question like how many records in this data set are related to something, an allegation of neglect. So I'm going to scroll up here to the first row, which if you notice, the first row is your heading row. All of this is not values of data, it is the description of the data that's underneath it. And so you want to make sure that you have a header row, even for column C, where you see you're missing a lot of data values. You're not going to be able to do as much in Excel as you might want to do if you're missing a column header for a one of your fields. So even if it's only got one, if it had one cell, let's see if we can look down here. Yeah, you can see one cell in C21 has a date in it. You want to make sure that therefore you have a value assigned to that field, and in this case we call it the closure date. If you don't have that, Excel is not going to be able to recognize it as easily as you're going to want it to. So it's really important that when you're working with data, always have a header for every single column of data that you have to work with. So our question was, how many of these records, of these 1,802 records, are related to an allegation of neglect? So to do that, we're going to filter. We're going to click on this top row, which is your header row. And I'm working in the Mac version of Excel, so it might be a bit different than if you're working with a PC. But for me, finding the filter button is on the data ribbon. So I'm clicking on data, and if you're not sure, just go up to search Excel, and you can type in filtering or anything, and Excel will help you find out where it is based on the version of Excel that you have. But what I'm doing is I'm going to the data ribbon and I'm clicking over here on filter. And when I do that, you'll see these little arrows suddenly pop up. And here's what those arrows are doing. So looking over to column I, which is the one that has the allegation in it, I'm going to click on the arrow next to allegation. And what you'll see down below is a summary of all of the values that it sees in that field. So instead of scrolling through 1,800 records, it's looking through all 1,800 records and saying, look, I see fields that say the word abuse, I see fields that say the word child fatality, I see fields that say neglect, and I see fields that say sexual abuse. So you can be confident that there's nothing else in that column that has a value other than the ones that you're seeing here, because it's summarizing all of them for you. So the question I asked was, how many neglect cases are in this data set? So what's great about this is it's a filter, meaning you can screen out things that you don't want or include things that you do want. And so instead of selecting all, I just want to pick neglect. That's the only type of allegation that I'm interested in. So I clicked on the box next to neglect, and then I closed out my, I can close out my filter. Now the entire data set is only showing me the instances where it sees neglect in the allegation field. And seldom used feature of Excel, if you look down on the bottom left of your screen, it actually quickly summarizes what it finds when you use a filter. So in this case, it says, I see 1,122 of 1,802 records found. So the answer to the question, how many neglect cases are in this data set, I could actually very quickly just tell you it's 1,122. Because we filtered on neglect, and then we look down at the bottom of our screen and it says this is how many records I found based on the filter that you've applied. So that's all filtering is doing, and we could do that. So I'm going to go up here. I'm going to remove that filter by selecting everything again. So now it brought back all 1,802 records. But you can look at it for all of these. So how many different variations on institutional abuse do we see? Well, that's a yes or no question. So there's only two options for that one. For backlog, what are the values that you see there? Yes and no, except for this case, it's the word no and the word yes, whereas in institutional abuse, it was the letter Y and the letter N. If you're filtering on numbers, it's a little bit harder because numbers usually have obviously a wider variation in what you're going to see. So this is going through and saying, like, I see the number -7. I'm not going to tell you how many times I see it, but I see it. There it is. And so it's giving you the full range of the data that it sees. So you can use a filter to sort of quickly be confident, like the values in this column don't go below -7 and they don't go above 394. So in terms of days overdue, if someone were to ask, what's the most number of days overdue in this data set, you could actually use filtering to quickly say, oh, it's 394. And you can also use filtering to sort of figure out, like, what's a data hygiene issue. So, or what could be a data hygiene issue. So somebody asked you, what's the least number of days overdue? You'd look, according to this, it's -7. So that either means that the case has 7 more days until it comes due, or it means that there's some error in the data set where you're calculating overdue as a negative number, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So you'd want to look into that and confirm what it is. Does that mean I've got 7 days until the case is due, or does that mean that there's some problem with the way the formula that's populating this field is calculated? So that's all filtering is. It's really simple, but it's a really quick way of answering some pretty basic questions about your data. And I just showed you how you could use it to answer a question like, how many neglect cases are there in this data set? But if I were to ask you a slightly more complicated question, remember I said under allegation we see all of these different types. If I were to ask you which type of allegation is associated with the most records, and you hadn't already done what we just did, it's a little bit harder to answer that, because you need to know, like, how many are there for abuse, how many are there for child fatality, how many are there for neglect, how many are there for sexual abuse. We sort of know that out of hand because we just did neglect, and neglect had 1,100, which no other one is going to have more than that. So neglect is probably going to come out on top. But to be certain, you need a better way to answer that question. So to better answer that question in a way that's a little easier to quantify and to prove, we're going to turn to pivot tables. And they sound, for some reason, scarier than they actually are. All pivot tables are is a giant way to filter and slice your data. So I'm going to teach you how to do it. So looking at this same data set, you can keep the filter on if you want, but I'm just going to take it off for simplicity. Let's say I was looking at this data set and I wanted to run a pivot on it. The first thing you do is you make sure that you have titles or headers for every single one of your fields. So if you'd come in here and there was no title for closure date because it was missing some values, you want to make sure you added the title closure date, because if you don't have a title on your header, Excel is not going to like it, and it's going to say, I can't make a pivot table out of this. So make sure that you have headers on all of your fields, and I'm scrolling across to make sure that we do. and it looks like we do, all the way over to column AE, which is risk status. So everything has a column header. That's good news. And so basically we want to create a pivot table by selecting all of this data. And the easiest way to select all of your data is to just scroll up to the top leftmost corner of the data set, right to the top left of cell A1, and just click on it, and you'll notice that the color sort of changes on your screen because you've selected all of the data in this worksheet. Now, depending on what version of Excel you're using, the way that you actually go to insert the pivot is slightly different. Again, I'm using the Mac version of Excel. So for me, I go to the Insert ribbon, and Pivot Table is right there. I think for other versions, it's on the Data ribbon. Again, just check which version you have, Google it, and it'll tell you how to insert a pivot table. But all I did is select all the data, and then I go to Insert, and I'm going to click Pivot Table. And when I do that, it gives me a pop-up menu, sort of, that says, I need you to make two decisions. First, choose the data you want to analyze. Well, I've already done that. It's selected the table or range. And you can see here that I've selected referral data, which is the name of the worksheet that I'm working on. And it begins in column A and goes all the way through column AE, and it selects everything. So I'm fine with that. I'm going to keep that as it is. And then it's asking you where to place the pivot table. Depending on what you're doing, you might want to embed your pivot table in an existing worksheet, but I think the safest bet is almost always to insert your pivot table in a new worksheet. So that's what I'm going to keep that selected here and click OK. And then all of a sudden, you're going to see a new worksheet created. Down here, for me, it's sheet 2. And I like to quickly just rename it. So let's just call this pivot. I like to quickly rename it so that I know which of my sheets has data on it and which of my sheets has a pivot table on it. So what you notice here is it's sort of empty, and there's this odd box on the right called a pivot table builder. In some versions of Excel, this is called your field list. This is calling it my pivot table builder. It's the same basic thing. You'll notice when I clicked over here on the pivot table that, or when I clicked down here, that my field list disappeared. If you ever want it back, you can just click on the pivot table itself, which is this boxed in area. And the pivot table builder will pop back up. If it doesn't, you can always go back to your sort of pivot table ribbon and ask it to show you the field list, which is what it's calling it here. The field list here and the pivot table builder are the same thing. So what the heck is this? This is a way of looking at your data differently. So let me just relate it back to what we just did. This field name, all this is the list of field headings that you have. So we had 31, I believe, fields in the data set. You're just seeing the titles at the top of each of those columns here. So you had referral ID, referral date, closure date, capstat date, blah, 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 blah. Allegation, that's the one that we were looking at before. So all that list is the list of field headers that you have. And then you've got this 4-quadrant area below it. And the beauty is you can do whatever you want. So the question I originally asked was which type of allegation is associated with the most records. So let me drag allegation down to rows just to show you what this is going to do. So I'm dragging allegation to rows, and all of a sudden you can see my pivot table, which is the thing over here, change. And remember how I saw on the filter that there were 4 types of allegations there: abuse, child fatality, neglect, and sexual abuse? Well, those are repeated here. So all this is doing is the exact same thing that a filter is doing. It's saying, hey, I've looked at your data. These are the types of allegations that I see. But that's all it's doing. All I've done is say, show me the values that you see in this field and put those values on the rows. But the question was, how many records are associated with each of these allegations and which one of them has the most? So to do that, you need to drag something else over to what's called the values quadrant so that it counts how many records you're seeing. Now this part gets a little tricky only because you want to pick something that has that's going to be uniquely counted. So let me just explain by showing you. I'm going to take referral ID, which if I show you back over to my the actual data, referral ID when you're looking at it is just chronologically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way down to 1802. And so these should be unique values, I hope. We'll see in a second. See if these should be unique values. So when I drag referral ID to values, one of two things is going to happen. And honestly, I have never figured out how and why Excel decides to do what it does here. But in this case, it did the right thing, which is it counted the number of referral IDs that it sees. So you'll recall that we have 1802. And let me make this easier to see here. Hold on. View. I'm just going to zoom so that my screen is easier to see. So it's basically saying I see 538 referral IDs associated with abuse. I see 6 referral IDs associated with child fatality. I see 1,122, remember that number, that are associated with neglect. I see a grand total of 1,802 referral IDs. Sometimes Excel does something different when you drag a number to values. Sometimes it does a sum. And what I'm doing here is I'm going down and I'm clicking on this little I, this little information button on the right, and it brings up this field sort of formatting options list or values list. And I can switch here between a count and a sum. Now sometimes it'll sum on any number that you see. So if I had drugged this down and the referral ID to values and it had by default done the sum of referral ID, what it's doing is it's adding the numbers that it sees together. And that's not what you want to do in this case. The question was, how many records do you see associated with it? So I was using the record ID as just an indicator that there was a unique record there. Whereas if I'm adding those referral IDs, this number doesn't mean anything. So 500,440 referral IDs associated with abuse. Well, we don't have that many records in this database. So this is not the correct way to use the values field. You want to switch it to where it's counting when the question is how many records do we have. Let's say there, instead of record ID, the question was sort of like how much has been paid in fees associated with each of these cases, and there was currency in that field, and you wanted to add up all the fees that have been paid, then it would make sense to use a sum. But in this case, it doesn't make sense to use a sum. So when we're asking the question, which of these allegation types is associated with the most number of cases, now you can sort of prove it, that the biggest chunk of them is associated with neglect. But let's say I asked, like, what percentage of them are associated with neglect? When you're doing calculations from a pivot table, I highly recommend that you use a pivot table to find the data that you need, but then use a separate worksheet to do analysis on the data that you need, to make calculations on the data that you need. And sort of here's why. Let's say that I quickly said, all right, I want to say what proportion, so I'm going to divide this 1122 out of 1802, and it's telling me that that equals 62%. And that's fine. That's the right answer. And if I was just answering the question, what percentage of cases are associated with neglect, it would be 62%, and that's fine. But let's say I park that answer right here in cell D6. That's a perfectly appropriate place to put it. However, let's say that I have a different, more complicated question. And let me just see. Where I ask, like, how many of these records are associated with anonymous reporters by the type of allegations you have. And it's going to say, alert, do you want me to replace the contents of the destination cell? So what it's saying is, I'm about to put data on top of where you've parked your 62% calculation. Are you sure you want me to do that? Well, I don't, because I sort of want to keep track of the calculations that I've done. So I'm going to say no, don't do that. I'm going to delete this 62%. And so what I recommend doing is I recommend creating a new sheet, and sometimes I just call it analysis. So I'm going to rename, call it analysis. I'm going to go back to my pivot, and whenever you've made a pivot in order to answer a question, I just copy the pivot itself, the values that it's showing me, and I paste them. So I'm just going to paste special. I want the values, and I will rename it, so allegation type. Let me make this bigger so that you're not straining to see it. So allegation type, number of records, and you can sort of clean this up. So we didn't have any blanks, so I'm going to delete the blank row. And if you want to, make sure you're using formulas, you could change this to where it's a sum of everything before it. And so now when I want to answer a question like what proportion, let's do percent of total. So now I can say for every one of them, I want to know what proportion of it is it of the total. And if I'm going to do that for all of them, I want to make sure that it always grabs B8 here. So I'm going to put $ in front of both the B and the 8 to say, to make an absolute reference. Oops. I'm not sure what happened there. And I'm going to drag this down to where now it's dividing everything by B8. And since this is a percent, I'm going to change the format to a percentage. And oftentimes it's good with percentages to sort of add in the decimal places just so you know that you don't really have 0%. You've got just a very small percentage here. So now I'm able to answer the question with specificity. It's 62.26% of the cases are associated with neglect. And if I have a new question, so I'll go back to my pivot table, and I'm going to add in anonymous reporter, and it's adding in yes or no. Now this is telling me how many of these cases are associated with anonymous reporters, yet no, these are not, 1,623 of them are not associated with anonymous reporters, 1,179 are associated with anonymous reporters, and the majority of those cases are neglect cases as well. Now I'm able to add new data to answer new questions, and let's say I wanted to do some analysis on this. You just copy it, and I'm going to paste it over back to my analysis tab and paste it here. So same thing, allegation type, and this was, remember, this is the not associated with an anonymous reporter. Anonymous. And again, you can clean it up. I'm just going to delete these by shifting cells left. Total cases. Instead of doing a blank, I'm going to do a total. You can do a sum here. So now in one sheet, I'm able to keep track of all the questions that I'm answering, and in one pivot, I'm able to sort of constantly manipulate the data and change it. Now, some people don't like to do that. Some people like to create new pivot table and new pivot table and new pivot table and keep everything separate in different worksheets. That's totally appropriate and totally fine. I actually prefer that when I'm grading assignments when people do that. But this is a way to do it that I think can be helpful. So just briefly, let me talk about the other quadrants before I wrap up. So you've got these 4 quadrants. The filters is a really useful quadrant that we haven't really used. Let me give you an example here. Right now we've said how many of these cases are associated with anonymous reporters, and then let's say how many victims are below the age of 5, I'm going to move that to filters. Now, when you move it to filters, you don't see the table change because you haven't really done anything yet. You just basically said, I'm going to filter this data eventually on something that relates to the age of the victims being under 5. And so now if you look above your pivot table, you have this all victims less than 5 years old, and its default is all because it's including all the records that it sees. So you haven't changed the data yet, but if you click on this filter, it's going to give you the options and say, I want to look at cases where all of the victims are yes, younger than 5 years old, and so I click yes, and now it has isolated it down to the 463 records where all of the victims in the case are younger than 5 years old, but it's still breaking those out by the allegation type and whether the reporting was anonymous or not. So in one sort of way of looking at the data, you're able to exclude data that you don't want to see. You're able to group data into categories by across multiple categories and sort of cross-tab it, and it ends up being a really powerful way to look at your data. So that is a basic primer on how to do pivot tables in Excel, and I think starting with the concept of filtering, is a really useful way to understand that, and hopefully you'll find this useful as you complete your assignments.